I built this tool when I was on the school board years ago when I realized the complexity of understanding the district's budget and the budget development. And there's so many variables to it, there's so many iterations to it. And in order to cycle through all the variables that need to be evaluated, I saw that it was necessary to build something that didn't require, with every iteration, somebody had to go off to their own spreadsheet somewhere to construct it. So I built what I call the budget modeling utility, and this is a refresh of one that I had built years ago. So let's start on the right side here, where I have output. So I want to start with what comes out of this, and then we'll get into what goes into it in the inputs. And let's start in 2022. So these are the actual audited results for Grosse Pointe in the year that ended in June of 2022. And you can see I've got enrollment here. We've got the state and local portions of the foundation allowance, which then calculates what revenue we derive by taking the per pupil amount by the number of students, then a bucket of all of the other revenue to show that the total revenue in 2022 was just shy of 96 million. So then we can compare that to the expense side. And I found that we really need to look at expenses more in these categories of salary and benefits, purchase services and supplies, as opposed to categories like instruction, instructional support, et cetera. I mean, those are important, and we can use some of those fields in other ways that we look at financial analysis. But for the construction of the budget, it makes a lot more sense to use salary, benefits, supplies, and purchase services. So the total salaries of the district in 2022 were just under 51 million, which, as you can see, is already over half of the total revenues for 2022. Then we have to put FICA costs on top of that. Of course, retirement costs are a big component. We had health components, other employee benefits. Then here's your purchase services, supplies, for total of expenses of just under 101 million. So with 101 million against revenue of 96 million, you can see exactly how the district operated at a $5.2 million shortfall for the 2022 year. Fund equity began the year at about 15 million. Take away 5 million, we're left with about just shy of 10 million in fund equity, which as a percentage of total revenue is about 10%. So this is the baseline of the BMU. And as you can see, or if you want to check for yourself, it completely ties off to the district's financial audit for that year. So let's continue to stay on the right side in the outputs area. And we know we already have a 2023 budget. It's what we're operating from right now, and the numbers here tie off to the amended budget, the one that was passed a couple of months ago. So it was the second iteration of the 22-23 budget, which is the year we are in now. And let's go right down to revenue here, and you can see this big jump in revenue from 2022 to 2023 that went from 96 million to 107 million. So a really large increase of revenue. And it took me a while to understand what could have driven that amount of revenue, particularly as we see reduction in enrollment, which we know is an ongoing problem. And the short version of it is that in 2022, the district under collected and under levied for the hold harmless per pupil that were allotted by proposal A. And it's an abnormally low $1,230 per pupil. And I'm going to skip ahead to 2024 to show that in a normal operating state, the local hold harmless revenue would be $1,695 per pupil. So because it was abnormally low in 22, It then became abnormally high in 23, which is why you see this large increase of revenue. One of the reasons why you see this large increase of revenue from 2022's 96 million to 2023's 103.7 million. So what that means is that in 2022, part of the reason why the shortfall was as pronounced as it was is because the hold harmless revenue per pupil was lower than it should have been, which also means that in 2023, since we were catching up to the shortfall of 2022, that it's higher than normal, which is why the revenue had such a marked increase. So if we stay in 2023 for a second here, you can see that on the expense side, salaries have gone up by whatever that is, call it $500,000 or something like that. FICA is going to be a fixed percentage. Retirement stays about flat because it's a percentage of salaries, which were basically flat. They went up a little bit, as you can see. Health benefits had a huge increase, and this was one of the areas that I didn't fully understand. I haven't. Maybe we had some catastrophic health events, that kind of thing happened, but this was a big help in 2022 with healthcare costs being 7 million, and then with a jump to over 10 million in 23 is a huge hit to expenses. So which is aided by or masked or whatever, offset by the huge increase in revenue. Then you can see in purchase services, expenses year over year were down about $1 million. That's a pretty significant amount. Supplies were a little bit up. I think that was about 3%. And so total expenses were or are projected to be 103.6 million against revenues of 103.6 million. So the operating result, I mean, I'm showing a tiny surplus here as the district is showing, but it's basically a flat budget. So the ending fund equity last year was 9.7 million. That's our beginning fund equity for this year. And then fund equity should end about flat with what it was the year before. We just walked through how fund equity has basically no change, up slightly, but how could ending fund equity percentage go down? Well, it's because the fund equity percentage is a measure of fund equity over revenue. So you see that in 2022, with that lower revenue of 96 million, the percentage comes in at 10%. And despite operating basically at a break-even budget is what's projected for 23, fund equity percentage goes down to 9.4% because the revenue is bigger for the reasons that we just walked through. And we'll hit that again here as now we kind of turn our sights to the inputs side of the BMU. And the inputs for 2023 are what are in the current amended budget. So the current amended budget has enrollment down 141 students. The foundation went up a healthy $487 per student. So you're multiplying that by the 6,495 students over here. So that's a big increase to revenue. No change in the local operating millage. We'll cover that in detail in some other presentation, but for now, just know that it's pretty much a flat $1,467 per student. Then we have the local hold harmless revenue per pupil, and you can see this large increase. So this is a change over 2022, which is not in the column here, but the hold harmless revenue per pupil in 2023 went up $930 over 2022, which is a huge increase, and gets it to a total of this 2,160. So that's a huge factor in 2023. There's about 17 million of state aid that we receive that is restricted, meaning that when you get it, it needs to be spent in a very precise way as defined and audited by the state. So that is not from per pupil revenue. That is more program specific, a lot of added needs types of categories there. We have other local revenues of about $1 million. We can cover that in more detail later. But then here's the Wayne County Enhancement Millage, and it's 3.1 million. So this is a big help to the budget. Federal revenues running high here in 23 as we continue to benefit from the ERA funds, and we'll cover that in the next couple years to see what happens there. Then we have some transfers in. This is money that comes into the general fund from the special education fund, which basically is a cross charge internal to the district as the special education services need to keep the general fund whole for what it consumes out of the budget. We had a 2% on schedule salary increase. We can cover what on schedule means later, but basically it means that the salary grid was increased by 2% everywhere. There were staff composition changes, so this could have been, I think there were maybe 10 to 20 somewhere in there layoffs, and plus you had some retirements and things like that. So that brings some cost out of the budget, a negative number. We have our FICA costs. I think most people know that that's a 7.65, but since we have a certain number of salaries that we pay that are not through normal payroll, that the FICA number has to be adjusted down a little bit accordingly. We have a large retirement rate. That needs its whole other presentation, but this is a combination of local and state retirement for MIPSers that we have to pay. Then here's that big increase in 2023 again of how we had such a large health benefit cost increase that's projected to take it from basically 7 million to 10.1 million. So that's a really big deal. That's a really big hit to the budget. Other employee benefits went down a little bit. Purchase services costs went down a little bit. Supplies went up a little bit of capital outlay and some other things. So that's all of your inputs. Now, if the budget holds completely true to this, which the odds are that it won't because it almost never does, the same result would happen. We'd operate basically at slightly over of a break-even budget, and fund equity would end at roughly that same 9.7 million that we've talked about before. But now to wrap this up, it's really important that you remember what we covered here about the local hold harmless and how it was abnormally low in 22, abnormally high in 23. So what that means in 24, it's got to get back to normal, which if everything had been even, all of this would have been $1,695 per student in each of these 4 years. But because of these adjustments or changes, it had a really big effect on the bottom line results for both 22 and 23. It made 22 lower than it really should have been, but it also made 23 really higher than it should have been. So now what that means is that we got to get back to normal in 24, and that's the budget that needs to be constructed now. So let's get back to the inputs here. The district's projecting another enrollment decline. This time we've got it modeled at 130 student loss. The state is talking about a $450 increase to the foundation allowance because their tax revenues have been really strong. No change again in the local operating millage. And here is the fix then of how hold harmless per pupil gets back to normal. It's got to go down by $465 per student. So in effect, you can look at this and say, any gains that we would have received from the state foundation allowance get clawed back as the local hold harmless gets back to normal. And in this model, I basically have just said, let's assume no change in state restricted grants, really no change in other local revenue. Wayne County enhancement stays the same. Federal revenue stays the same, which is what the district is projecting. And then transfers stay about the same. Let's say that we model this with a 1.5% on schedule salary increase, no change in staff composition. This is a big X factor. We need the district's got to come forward and with their projection of what they think is going to happen here. No change in FICA, no change in retirement. much smaller increase in healthcare benefits of 5%. We need to get some guidance as to whether that's in alignment with what our, the folks we pay to give us advice on that. Um, Slight increase in other employee benefits. It's a really small number here, so that percentage is almost meaningless. Slight increase in purchase services, slight increase in supplies, and then no change in capital outlay and these other categories. So when we put all of those inputs in all of this column, the outputs give us this. And let's see what happens here. So you see enrollment is down. You see the state per pupil is up because of the 450 over here. You see the local operating millage staying flat. We see the local hold harmless getting back to its normal level, 1695, which means that the per pupil total of proposal A revenue is basically flat from 23 to 24. Which and so that would mean that total Prop A revenue is down slightly. Why? Because enrollment's down 130 in this model, and other revenue is basically flat. Call it $300,000 less for total revenue of 101.8 million, which is a decrease from last year's or this year's 103.7. Again, because of the hold harmless revenue adjustments or fixes. So in this model, salaries are up about 800,000. That's what 1.5% does to salaries. FICA is just a percentage of salaries. Retirement is a percentage of salaries. Here's health benefits going up. So you can see here a 5%, which is fairly moderate increase in health benefit, costs the district 500,000 more. So 10.14 million becomes 10.65 million. Other employee benefits basically flat. Purchase services up a little bit, call it 200, 300 grand. Supplies up a little bit, but total expenses up from this year's 103.6 to next year's potentially 105.6, which is an increase. Expense increase driven by all of these changes. That all would deliver an operating loss of another 3.8 million. And if the starting fund equity of 9.7 million goes down by 3.8 million, it becomes a 5.9 million ending fund equity, which is a 5.8% ending fund equity. So that's what I would view as sort of a baseline starting point of if we made almost no changes in the operating budget and we made these assumptions about enrollment and the state foundation allowance and what we know is going to happen to the local hold harmless, we would operate at basically a $4 million shortfall for 2024. Now, all kinds of dials we can play with here. Let's in a scenario that gets worse, let's say that we have another really bad surprise in enrollment. Instead of losing 130 students, let's say we lost 250, just to kind of give you an example.